I was inside the aft equipment bay of a Cessna Citation XLS Plus at 7:15 on a Saturday morning in March when I stopped moving. Not because something was about to explode. Not because I had touched something wrong or found a fault that was going to kill someone in the next 30 seconds. I stopped because I was looking at something that changed what I thought I was looking at, and that kind of recognition, the kind that reorganizes your understanding of a situation while you're still standing inside it, takes a moment to process even when you have been doing this work for 17 years. The deformation was approximately 8 inches across at its widest point, in the lower left quadrant of the aft pressure bulkhead. It was painted over. Not repainted, painted, a layer of primer gray paint applied over the surface in a color that was close to but not exactly the factory coating. Close enough that the exterior inspection I had completed 40 minutes earlier had not caught it. Not close enough that I, standing inside the bay with a flashlight and the specific attention of someone who had been looking at aircraft structures for 17 years, missed it for more than the time it took to move the flashlight beam 2 inches to the left. The deformation was consistent with a tailstrike event. The paint was consistent with someone trying to make sure nobody found it. Graham Holt and 8 associates were in the Lakeside Aviation FBO waiting room, scheduled to board in 15 minutes. I looked at what I was looking at for 15 seconds. Then I took my phone out of my chest pocket and dialed the Denver FSDO. Not Graham Holt's number, not the Lakeside Aviation office, the FAA. Holt's 7:30 departure did not happen. The aircraft was grounded pending a full structural inspection by Cessna's engineering team. The inspection, which took 11 days, confirmed that the aft pressure bulkhead had sustained damage in a tailstrike event at a private airfield in Nevada 8 months earlier, that the damage had been concealed by a Las Vegas maintenance provider without the required FAA reporting, and that the aircraft had flown 43 times since the event without disclosure. 43 times, including the flight that 9 people were about to board. What Graham Holt said to me in the FBO that morning, in front of my colleague Frank DeLuca, in front of his 8 associates, in front of my 9-year-old daughter Cora, who was sitting in the waiting area with her colored pencils, is one part of this story. What I said in response is another, but the part I want to tell you about first is the 15 seconds inside that access panel, because those 15 seconds are where the story actually is. I grew up in Littleton, Colorado, south of Denver, close enough to the Front Range that the mountains were part of the daily visual landscape in the way that things become when they are always present, not dramatic, but simply there, the background against which everything else is measured. My Uncle Bud worked at Centennial Airport for 22 years as a line service technician. He had taken me to the airport on Saturdays from when I was 7 years old, not to teach me anything, not with any formal intention, but because Bud liked company on weekend shifts and I liked aircraft and the combination worked for both of us for 11 years. I spent those Saturday mornings on the ramp watching what happened when machinery and skill and the specific requirements of flight met the specific requirements of the people who needed to get somewhere. What I absorbed was not a curriculum. It was a way of paying attention, the specific quality of attention that aircraft demand, which is total and accurate and does not permit approximation. You cannot be almost sure about an aircraft. Almost sure is how people die. I got my A&P certificate from Denver Aero in 2009 at 23 years old and my inspection authorization in 2015. I worked at 2 regional operations before joining Lakeside Aviation Services at Centennial Airport in 2014. I had been at Lakeside for 10 years. I was, at 38, the most experienced technician Lakeside employed on business jet maintenance. Frank DeLuca had been in private aviation maintenance for 30 years and was 64 years old and was going to retire in June, and was spending his final months doing what he had done for 30 years. Excellent work, expressed in the minimum number of words consistent with the work being done correctly. Frank and I had worked alongside each other for 10 years and had developed the specific communication efficiency of 2 people who have worked in proximity long enough to have moved past all the words that weren't necessary. I met Jennifer in 2010. We married in 2013. Cora was born in 2015. Jennifer died in February 2021 from a progressive form of multiple sclerosis, 4 years from the first symptoms to the end. Cora was 5 years old. I took 3 weeks. Then I came back because Cora needed her father present, and the work was the place where presence was required in a way that left no room for absence, which in the first year was what I needed the work to be. Cora grew up with the airport the way certain children grow up with whatever their parents' work produces as an environment, not as a destination, but as a landscape. She knew the aircraft types that used Centennial by silhouette. She knew the difference between a turboprop and a pure jet by sound. She had opinions about the FBO waiting room snack selection that she had communicated to Frank on multiple occasions, and that Frank had received with the seriousness he gave all information he considered relevant. She was in that waiting room on this particular Saturday in March because her community theater program had been canceled due to a flooding issue at the venue, and my mother Diane was at a medical appointment and there was nowhere else to be. She had her colored pencils and her sketch pad, and the self-sufficient quality of a 9-year-old who has learned that her father's work sometimes required his complete attention, and that the correct response to this was to make her own. She was drawing aircraft from memory when I found what I found in the access panel at 7:15 a.m. Graham Holt had founded Holt Meridian Group in 1998 at 31 years old, a logistics company that had grown from a regional freight operation to a mid-size enterprise with operations in 8 states. He was 57 years old and had been in the FBO since 6:45 a.m., early enough to establish urgency, late enough not to have to wait long. He had his coffee and his laptop and his 8 associates arranged around the waiting room in the configuration of people who were ready to work and were waiting for the transportation that would take them to where the work was. The Citation XLS+, registration N441GH, had been purchased by Holt Meridian Group in 2019. I had worked on it 14 times in 5 years. I knew it the way a conscientious mechanic knows an aircraft he sees regularly, its service history, its tendencies, the particular way it had accumulated hours over 5 years of regular use. What I did not know, what no one at Lakeside Aviation knew, was that on a Tuesday evening in July of the previous year, the Citation had made a hard landing at a private airstrip outside Henderson, Nevada. The tail had struck the runway. The flight crew had assessed the damage visually, concluded it was cosmetic, and continued operations. The aircraft had been taken to a maintenance provider in Las Vegas, not Lakeside, not a Cessna-authorized service center, and the structural damage had been addressed in the specific way that structural damage gets addressed when the person addressing it does not want anyone to know it happened. Paint. The aircraft had flown 43 times since the tailstrike, including 14 flights in the previous 30 days, including the flight that was scheduled to depart Centennial Airport at 7:30 a.m. I had begun the pre-departure check at 6:50 a.m. At 7:12 a.m., during the engine ground run, the left engine did not reach the correct RPM on the spool-up sequence. The discrepancy on the engine monitoring system was small enough to be an instrument fault or a fuel control unit issue. Something manageable, something that might or might not delay the departure. I had opened the aft equipment bay panel for exactly the reason I told the FSDO duty officer 40 minutes later, to check the fuel control system. The fuel control system was fine. I looked at the deformation for 15 seconds. I want to be specific about what those 15 seconds were, because they were not paralysis and they were not panic. They were the specific cognitive process that happens when you see something that requires your existing understanding of a situation to be completely restructured before you can respond to it correctly. In the first second or two, I was confirming what I was seeing, making sure the flashlight was at the right angle, that I was not misreading a shadow or a manufacturing mark or a repair that had been properly documented somewhere in the aircraft records I had reviewed before the pre-departure check. I was not misreading anything. In the next several seconds, I was understanding the implications. A deformation in the aft pressure bulkhead of this type and this pattern meant a tailstrike event. A tailstrike event of sufficient force to deform the pressure bulkhead meant structural damage that required FAA reporting and engineering assessment before the aircraft returned to service. The paint over the deformation meant someone had made a decision not to report it and not to have it assessed. The aircraft had been signed off as airworthy by maintenance providers, including Lakeside, including me, without this information. In the final seconds, I was understanding what I was going to do and what it was going to cost. The 9 people who were going to board this aircraft in 15 minutes were the reason the cost did not matter. I took my phone out of my chest pocket. I called the Denver FSDO. The duty officer answered on the second ring. I identified myself and gave my A and P and IA certificate numbers. I identified the aircraft by registration number and owner. I described the location of the deformation, its approximate dimensions, its appearance, and the evidence of concealment. I said I was declining to release the aircraft for flight pending FAA inspection. The duty officer said they would have an inspector at Centennial within 2 hours. I said, "Thank you." I climbed out of the equipment bay. Frank was on the ramp. He had come out when the departure time started approaching, and I had not come back. He looked at me, and I could see from his expression that he had already read something in the way I was moving. The specific change in a person's movement when what they are carrying has gotten heavier. I told him what I had found. I told him what I had done. Frank looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "Good." One word. He walked to the aircraft and pulled the boarding stairs away and positioned the ground support equipment in the way that communicated clearly and without ambiguity that the aircraft was not going anywhere. I walked to the FBO. Holt was at the window when I came in. He had seen Frank pulling the stairs. He had the expression of a man who has managed a complex operation for 26 years and has a finely calibrated sense of when something is wrong, combined with the equally calibrated assumption that whatever was wrong was solvable and that the person standing in front of him was the one responsible for solving it. He said something. It was long, and it was specific, and it was delivered in the register of a man who is furious and is channeling the fury through the language of professional consequence. What this would mean for the contract, who he would be speaking to about it, what Lakeside could expect in terms of the ongoing relationship. He said it in front of his 8 associates who were understanding that their flight was not happening. He said it in front of Frank, who had come in from the ramp and was standing near the door with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who has heard things like this before and has developed the ability to hear them without reaction. He said it in front of Cora, who had put her colored pencils down on the seat beside her and was watching her father with the complete and unblinking attention of a 9-year-old who has correctly identified this as the most important thing currently happening. When Holt finished, I looked at him. I said, "The FAA is on their way." 2 words. 4, if you count the contraction. Then I turned to Frank and asked him to secure the maintenance logbooks and make them available for the FSDO inspector when they arrived. Frank nodded and went to get the books. I looked at Cora. She was still watching me. She had not picked up her colored pencils. I gave her the specific look that meant we were fine and that she should go back to what she was doing. She held my look for a moment, assessing in the way she assessed things, and then picked up her colored pencils and went back to her drawing. Gerald Park from the Denver FSDO arrived at Centennial Airport at 9:15 a.m. He was a 15-year FAA veteran with the specific quality of attention of someone whose job was to find exactly what I had found, and who had developed over 15 years the ability to read the temperature of a room the moment he walked into it. He read this one in about 4 seconds. He looked at me. He looked at Frank. He looked at Holt, who had moved from furious to the contained stillness of a man who understood that the situation had acquired dimensions that made his fury irrelevant. Gerald said, "Show me." I showed him. He was in the equipment bay for 22 minutes. He used his own flashlight and a mirror and a measurement tool and made notes in the specific unhurried way of someone who understood that thoroughness was more important than speed and who had been practicing thoroughness for 15 years. He photographed everything from multiple angles. He asked me 3 questions. I gave him 3 specific answers. When he came out of the bay, he had the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and would have preferred not to find it. He said, "The aircraft is formally grounded pending structural inspection." He looked at Holt's chief of staff, Holt was on his phone in the corner, and said that the FAA would require all maintenance records for the aircraft for the previous 18 months. Then he looked at me and said he would need a formal statement and could I be available at the FSDO office on Monday morning. I said I could. He said, "Good work, Mr. Reeves." He said it quietly and without emphasis, the way that people who mean something say it without making a performance of the meaning. What followed over the next 3 weeks was an investigation that involved the Denver FSDO, the Las Vegas FSDO, Cessna's engineering team, the attorneys for Holt Meridian Group, the maintenance provider in Las Vegas whose work had produced the concealment, and the 2 pilots who had been aboard the Citation during the Nevada tailstrike and who had made the decision not to report it. I was interviewed twice. My statements were consistent because the facts were consistent and the facts were documented, and I had done nothing that required anything other than an accurate account of what I had seen and what I had done. Cessna's engineers confirmed the structural assessment. The damage was real and the concealment had been deliberate, and the aircraft had been flown in a condition that could have had consequences at altitude that would not have been recoverable. Holt Meridian Group received civil penalties. The Las Vegas maintenance provider's certificate was suspended. The flight crew faced FAA certificate action. The aircraft underwent a structural repair at a Cessna-authorized service center and returned to service after 11 days. Lakeside Aviation Services received a formal letter of commendation from the Denver FSDO for the actions of technician Matthew Reeves on the morning of March 16, 2024. 2 weeks after the investigation concluded, Holt Meridian Group terminated their maintenance contract with Lakeside Aviation Services. The contract had been worth approximately $180,000 per year. Ray Kowalski, who owned Lakeside, had built it over 23 years and understood what the contract loss meant to the company's revenue, called me into his office the day after the termination notice arrived. He said, "We lost the Holt contract." I said, "I know." He looked at his desk for a moment. Then he said, "Worth it?" I said, "I know." He said, "That's all." I went back to work. I want to tell you about the drive home on the day it happened. That Saturday afternoon, the FSDO interviews done, the aircraft secured and tagged, Frank's logbooks handed over, Holt's associates dispersed to other arrangements, and Holt himself gone from the FBO without speaking to me again. Cora and I drove south on I-25 toward Centennial. The same road. The one I drove on 200 times a year and thought about almost every time. Not the thinking you do when you're trying to think about something. The thinking that happens underneath the other thinking. The kind that never fully goes away. Cora had her book bag on her lap. She had been at the airport for 6 hours. She had watched everything from the waiting room and had understood enough of it that she had questions, which she held in the patient way. She held things until she had decided the right time to ask them. She said, "The man was angry at you." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because you called someone?" I said, "Because I called the FAA. The airplane wasn't safe to fly and I reported it. He needed to use the airplane." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the mountains. The Front Range in the March afternoon, still snow on the upper elevations, the light doing what it does at that latitude in that season. Then she said, "Were people going to get hurt?" I said, "Maybe. Not today, probably. But the damage I found was serious and it needed to be looked at properly before anyone flew on it." She said, "So you did the right thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "But he was still angry." I said, "Yes. Sometimes people are angry when you do the right thing because the right thing costs them something. That doesn't make it less right." She looked at the mountains for another moment. Then she said, "Will you lose your job?" I said, "No." She said, "Are you sure?" I thought about how to answer accurately. "Ray, my boss, he understands what I did and why. We'll lose the client. That costs the company money, but Ray knows I did what I was supposed to do." She said, "Okay." She looked at the mountains. After a while, she said, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "What if you hadn't opened that panel?" I looked at the road. I said, "I don't know. Maybe. But I was the one who opened it." She said, "Because the engine was wrong." I said, "Yes." She said, "So the engine being wrong was good?" I looked at her. She was working through the logical structure of the situation the way she worked through things, carefully, in sequence, not moving to the next piece until the previous one was clear. I said, "The engine being wrong was what showed me where to look. What I found when I looked, that was the thing that mattered." She thought about this. "So it worked out?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Because you looked?" I said, "Yes." She nodded. She reached into her book bag and took out her sketch pad and looked at the drawings she had made that morning. Aircraft from memory, 6 or 7 of them in various views, the specific accuracy that comes from years of looking at things carefully enough to remember them correctly. She said, "I drew the citation before you found the thing." I said, "I know. I saw you working on it." She said, "It looks different to me now, knowing what was wrong with it." I said, "Things usually do." She looked at the drawing for a while. Then she put the sketch pad away. She said, "I'm glad you opened the panel." I said, "Me too." She looked at the road ahead, the suburban sprawl of South Denver giving way to the wider spaces of the outer ring, the mountains holding their position at the western edge of everything. She said, "Mom would have been glad too." I kept my eyes on the road. I said, "Yes, she would have." Neither of us said anything else for the rest of the drive. The mountains were there at the edge of the afternoon the way they were always there, not demanding attention, simply present, the background against which everything else happened. 6 weeks later. A Tuesday evening in April. I was at the kitchen table doing maintenance logs, the monthly documentation I completed at the end of each billing cycle, the careful record of every inspection, every finding, every action taken. This documentation had been part of my professional practice for 17 years, and I gave it the same standard I gave the physical work. Complete, accurate, specific, signed. Cora was at the other end of the table doing homework, 4th grade math. She said, without looking up, "Dad." I said, "Yeah." She said, "In school today we talked about what it means to be brave." I said, "What did you come up with?" She said, "Different things. Some people said brave is when you're not scared. Mrs. Patterson said brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway." I looked at my maintenance log. I said, "Mrs. Patterson is right." Cora said, "Were you scared when you called the FAA?" She was looking at her math, not at me, asking the question sideways the way she asked the questions she had been carrying for a while. I said, "I was worried about what it would cost, about what Holt would do, about whether Ray would be okay with it." She said, "But you did it anyway." I said, "Yes." She said, "Because it was right." I said, "Because 9 people were about to get on that airplane." She thought about this. Then she went back to her math. After a while, she said, "I'm going to put Mrs. Patterson's definition in my notes." I said, "It's a good one." She wrote it down. Brave is when you're scared and you do it anyway. She underlined it once. I went back to the maintenance log. The table was quiet in the specific way that a table is quiet when 2 people are doing different work in the same space and neither of them needs to fill the silence because the silence is part of what they are doing together. Through the kitchen window, the April evening was coming in over the Centennial suburbs. The light that comes before the mountains go dark, warm and final, and without hurry. I signed the bottom of the maintenance log. I dated it correctly. I put it in the completed pile. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you found something, in a job, in a relationship, in any context, that you weren't supposed to find, and doing the right thing with it cost you something real? Not the dramatic version. The ordinary version, where you just did what you knew was right, quietly, and dealt with what came after. What did that cost you? And would you do it again? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people, real decisions, the kind that stay with you.